The car stopped half a mile from the main gate. Eleanor Harrington had instructed her driver, Thomas, to park along the hedge-lined service road, the narrow, unpaved track that the groundskeepers used on weekday mornings and that appeared on no guest's map. She had chosen it deliberately. Everything Eleanor did was deliberate. "Your Grace," Thomas said, his eyes finding hers in the rearview mirror. There was a question in them that his manners would never allow him to speak aloud. "I'll walk from here," she said simply. He came around to open her door without another word. 22 years in her service had taught Thomas that when the Duchess used that particular tone, calm, final, settled as stone, there was nothing left to discuss. He held the door, eyes forward, as Eleanor stepped out onto the gravel path. She was dressed plainly. A gray dress, modest and well-fitted but entirely without ornament. Flat shoes. A white apron folded neatly over one arm. Her silver hair, the kind of silver that lesser women camouflaged and Eleanor wore like a crown, was pinned tightly beneath a pale cotton cap. She carried no handbag, no jewelry, not even the single pearl earring she wore to breakfast every morning of her adult life. To anyone passing on the road, she was a woman of service. Capable, orderly, unremarkable. That was precisely the point. She walked the half-mile to the servants' entrance at the east side of Ashford Manor, her posture immaculate despite the uneven ground, the late afternoon light stretching long shadows across the lawn she had walked 10,000 times before. The estate smelled the way it always had: old roses, cut grass, and the faint mineral coolness that rose off the lake behind the eastern wing. She had come home as mistress of this house at 24 years old. She had buried her husband from its front steps. She had raised her son within its walls. Tonight she was entering through the back. Mrs. Partridge, the head housekeeper, was waiting just inside the door. She was a compact, capable woman in her 60s who had served the Harrington household for 30 years and who was, at this precise moment, visibly struggling to keep her expression neutral. "Mrs. Partridge," Eleanor said pleasantly. "Your GR," the housekeeper caught herself, cleared her throat. "Ellie, welcome. Lord William said to expect you." He did. Eleanor stepped inside, casting one brief, comprehensive glance around the kitchen. Everything was in order. Good. "I trust the staff have been informed of the arrangement." "They have. They're," Mrs. Partridge chose her word carefully, "cooperative." "Excellent. I won't require special treatment. I am this evening simply Ellie, new to the house." She handed Mrs. Partridge the apron. "I'll take a tray and make myself useful. The family is arriving at 6. The Callaways arrived 20 minutes ago." Eleanor checked the small clock above the kitchen doorway. She had time. She tied the apron herself, smoothly and without fuss, and accepted the silver tray that a wide-eyed young kitchen maid held out to her. The girl, she couldn't have been more than 19, was staring with the barely suppressed awe of someone who had been told a remarkable secret and was finding the reality of it even more remarkable than the telling. Eleanor gave her a small, reassuring nod. The girl exhaled. She moved through the house quietly. This was the skill, she had always believed, that separated the merely powerful from the truly formidable, the ability to be still, to watch, to resist the natural human impulse to announce oneself. Eleanor had sat in boardrooms, diplomatic dinners, and royal antechambers, and understood long before most people in those rooms that the one who speaks first reveals the most. She had no intention of speaking first tonight. She heard Vivienne Calloway before she saw her. The voice came from the front sitting room, bright, carrying, musical in the way of someone who had been told their laugh was charming and had been deploying it strategically ever since. Eleanor slowed her pace in the corridor, not stopping, simply adjusting her speed to allow the conversation to reach her fully. "Absolutely gorgeous, of course, but it's all so dark and heavy, isn't it? I keep imagining what it could look like with the right touch. Something lighter, more current." A pause, a murmur of agreement, the mother, Eleanor noted. Same vowels, different pitch. "William is attached to all of it for sentimental reasons. You know how he is. A soft laugh, indulgent and faintly condescending. But I think once we're settled, he'll come around." Eleanor continued walking, Her face betrayed nothing. She was passing the doorway to the sitting room when it happened. Vivienne had risen from her chair, reaching for something on the side table, and they came face to face for the first time. Vivienne looked at her the way people of a certain disposition look at household staff, a glance that registered just enough to confirm that the person before them required no further attention. "You there," Vivienne said. Not unkindly, but with the casual authority of someone who had never once questioned their right to use that particular phrasing. "The tablecloth in the dining room needs re-ironing. The left end. Someone's been careless." "Of course," Elinor said. Her voice was even unhurried. "I'll see to it." Vivienne had already looked away. Elinor moved down the corridor toward the dining room. Behind her, she heard Margaret Calloway's voice float through the sitting room door. Something about the drapes, something about London, something about William being fortunate that her daughter had such impeccable taste. Elinor set her tray down on the sideboard, smoothed the left end of the tablecloth methodically, and straightened to her full height. She had seen enough of Vivienne Calloway in 30 seconds to know everything she needed to know. But she would stay. She would watch. She would wait. Because Elinor Harrington had not survived 61 years, 37 of them at the helm of one of England's oldest families, by making decisions before all the evidence was in. A single candle, she had learned long ago, can only show you so much. She needed to see what they looked like in the dark. Dinner at Ashford Manor had always been a formal affair. Even in the quieter years after Richard's passing, when it was just Elinor and a rotating cast of weekend guests, the dining room had maintained its standards. Crystal glasses, pressed linen, candles lit at precisely 7. Elinor had never believed that standards were a performance for other people. She believed they were a promise you made to yourself about who you were, regardless of who was watching. Tonight, she watched others make an entirely different kind of promise. She moved between the kitchen and the dining room with the practiced invisibility of someone who had studied, in one evening, exactly how to become part of the furniture. The other staff, young James, who managed the wine service, and Agnes, a quiet woman in her 40s who had worked the manor for 6 years, moved with careful precision around her. Their awareness of who she truly was radiating off them in barely suppressed tension. Elinor had given each of them a single look at the start of service that communicated everything. Be calm, be normal, let the evening unfold. They were doing admirably. The Calloways were not. It began subtly, the way these things always do, small remarks that might, in isolation, be dismissed as nothing. Gerald Calloway, a broad, florid man who wore his new money like a coat 2 sizes too large, had spent the soup course holding forth on property values in the surrounding county, with the confidence of a man who had Googled the subject that morning. He spoke over William twice. He mispronounced the name of the village that had stood at the edge of the Ashford estate for 400 years, and did not pause when his wife gently corrected him. Margaret Calloway was subtler in her damage. She had the particular gift of the long-practiced social climber, the ability to deliver a slight inside a compliment, to wrap condescension in the language of admiration. She praised the dining room's proportions while noting that the wallpaper was wonderfully vintage. She called the estate characterful, in the tone one might use to describe a car that still ran despite its age. Vivienne said less during the main course. She was watching William with the focused attention of someone managing a situation rather than enjoying an evening. Whenever he shifted in his seat, she placed her hand on his. Whenever he seemed about to steer the conversation elsewhere, she asked him something that brought him back, small questions, artfully placed, that made him feel attended to without actually attending to anything he cared about. Elinor refilled the water glasses. She noted everything. It was Gerald who crossed the first real line. He had moved on to his third glass of wine. James had been impressively restrained in his pours, but Gerald had a habit of signaling for more before the glass was finished, and his voice had acquired that particular looseness that expensive wine gives to men who have no discipline with it. He leaned back in his chair and looked around the dining room with the proprietary air of a man already measuring for new furniture. "I'll say this," he announced to no one in particular. "It's a magnificent old pile. Shame about the upkeep costs. I've seen the kind of drain an estate this size puts on a family. Dead weight, some would say." William's jaw tightened. "It's been in my family for 3 centuries, Gerald." "Which is exactly the problem, isn't it?" Gerald laughed at his own observation. 3 centuries of sentiment, not always the best investment strategy. He waved his hand vaguely. "But that's the older generation for you. Speaking of which," he reached for his glass, settling into the casual cruelty of a man who believed he was among friends. "Where exactly is the famous Duchess mother? I half expected to find her presiding over the table like a portrait come to life." Margaret tittered. William said nothing. "From what I understand," Gerald continued, swirling his wine, "she's been rather absent from the scene for some time, tucked away somewhere in the countryside. One does wonder." He tapped his temple with one finger, the gesture unmistakable. Agnes made an almost imperceptible sound beside the sideboard. Alina crossed the room quietly and refilled Gerald Calloway's wine glass with absolute, unhurried composure. He didn't look at her once. Vivienne, who had been quiet through her father's performance, laughed then, a light, easy laugh, as though it were all terribly amusing. "Honestly," she said, leaning toward William with a confidential air, "as long as she stays out of our way, she can rot in whatever country house she's hiding in. We have enough to manage without," she caught herself, adjusted her smile, "without adding complications." William looked at the table. Alina looked at William. Across the distance of the room, in the practiced silence of service, something passed between them. He raised his eyes briefly to hers, and in them she saw what she had feared and hoped she wouldn't find. He had known or suspected and had chosen until now the harder mercy of hope over the easier relief of truth. She gave him the smallest nod. "Not yet." He looked away. The conversation moved. Plates were cleared. A dessert of poached pears and cream was served. The Calloways grew louder, more comfortable, more unguarded with every passing course. Margaret raised the question of the London apartment. "Surely William rattling around this estate alone makes no sense when you're married, darling." And Gerald began outlining, with some specificity, which wings of the manor were structurally redundant. Vivienne excused herself just before 10 o'clock. Alina counted to 15 before following with an empty tray. The hallway outside the dining room was dim, lit only by the wall sconces that threw warm amber light across the old stone. Vivienne stood at the far end with her back turned, phone pressed to her ear, her voice low but carrying in the quiet of the corridor. Alina moved without sound. I know," Vivienne was saying, and the warmth in her voice was a different warmth entirely from anything she had produced at the dinner table. Unguarded, real. Just a few more months and then it's done. He won't, a laugh soft and private, no, he genuinely has no idea. He's sweet, honestly. Just not exactly, a pause, and the smile in her voice sharpened into something else entirely. Poor, clueless William. The hallway was very quiet. Alina set the tray down on the side table beside her. She reached up. Slowly, deliberately, she removed the pins from her hair, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the silver cascade fell around her shoulders in a long, clean wave. She straightened her back. She lifted her chin. And she walked back toward the dining room doors and pushed them open. The dining room fell silent the way a held breath falls silent. Not the comfortable quiet of a natural pause in conversation, but the sudden, total stillness of a room that has been caught. Gerald Calloway had been mid-sentence, something about London architects and open-plan living when the doors opened. The words died in his mouth. Margaret, whose wine glass had been traveling toward her lips, stopped it there, suspended. William rose slowly from his chair, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment and had been rehearsing the standing of it for hours. Only Vivienne, returning from the hallway, a half-step behind Alina, understood first what she was seeing. The color left her face before any of the others had fully registered that something had changed. Alina walked to the head of the table, not quickly, not dramatically. She walked the way she had always walked into rooms that belonged to her, with the unhurried certainty of someone who has never once needed to prove their right to be somewhere. She stopped beside William. She rested one hand lightly on the back of his chair. She looked at the Callaways and said nothing. It was William who spoke. "Allow me to introduce my mother," he said quietly. "Eleanor Harrington, the Duchess of Ashford." The silence that followed had genuine weight. Gerald Calloway's wine glass completed its journey to the table with a small, graceless click. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, performing the expression of a woman whose social instincts were firing in 4 directions at once and finding no useful exit. Vivienne stood in the doorway, one hand still raised from where she had been smoothing her hair, and did not move. Eleanor looked at Gerald first. "You were wondering," she said, in a tone that was perfectly pleasant and utterly without warmth, "whether age had affected my faculties. I understand the concern. Allow me to reassure you." She clasped her hands gently before her. "I remember everything you said this evening, Mr. Calloway, every word, in the order you said it, including your thoughts on dead weight, on sentiment, and on the question of my mental fitness." She tilted her head precisely 1 degree. "You'll find, I think, that silence is very rarely the same thing as absence." Gerald opened his mouth. Eleanor continued. "The Ashford estate," she said, turning slightly toward Margaret, who had begun to compose a protest, "is held under a family trust established in 1871 and revised most recently in 2019. It cannot be sold, subdivided, liquidated, or significantly altered without the written consent of the sitting trustee." She smiled pleasantly. "That is me. I am the sitting trustee. I will remain the sitting trustee for as long as I am living, and I am, as you may have gathered, in excellent health." She let that settle. There is no London apartment. There is no redundant wing. There is nothing here that belongs to anyone who has not yet earned the right to belong to it. Margaret Calloway's social instincts finally selected their exit. "Now, really," she began, drawing herself up with the wounded dignity of someone who had never been spoken to this way, and intended to make that clear, "I don't think there's any need for—" "Mrs. Calloway." Eleanor's voice did not rise. It simply became more precise, the way a blade becomes more dangerous as it narrows. "Your daughter told my son, not 40 minutes ago, that I was welcome to rot in whatever country house I was hiding in. I was standing approximately 8 feet away at the time." She paused. "I've had the opportunity to reflect on the remark. I've decided not to take it personally. I have, however, decided to take everything else personally." She turned to Vivienne. The room held its breath. Vivienne had moved from the doorway during the preceding exchanges, drawn forward by some instinct toward the table, toward William, toward whatever ground still felt solid. She stood now at the edge of the candlelight, and in it Eleanor could see her clearly, the beauty, the intelligence, the carefully constructed surface of her, and beneath it, fracturing steadily, the understanding that the evening was over in every way that mattered. Eleanor spoke to her gently. That was perhaps the most devastating thing about it, the gentleness. "I watched you this evening," she said, "not as your enemy, as someone who loves her son and needed to understand who he had chosen." She paused. "I watched how you speak to people you believe cannot affect your future. I watched the patience you have for William in the rooms he occupies, and the patience you reserve for other conversations in the rooms he doesn't." She held Vivienne's gaze steadily. "I have spent my life building something worth protecting, and I have learned, at considerable personal cost, that character is not what people show you when the stakes are high. It is what escapes them when they believe no one important is watching." Vivienne's composure broke at the edges. "You don't understand. It wasn't what I can explain." "You don't need to explain anything to me," Eleanor said, "but I think you owe William a conversation." William, who had been standing very still through all of it, looked at Vivienne now with the expression of a man who has been hoping to be wrong and has just accepted that he isn't. "The phone call," he said quietly. "Who were you talking to?" The candlelight flickered. Vivienne said nothing, and her silence answered everything that needed answering. What followed was not a scene. Eleanor made sure of that. She had no interest in theater, only in conclusions. She crossed to the sideboard and rang the small silver bell once, with the unhurried calm of a woman ending a meeting that had run past its usefulness. Henderson, the head butler, appeared within moments in the doorway. "Henderson," Alina said pleasantly, "would you arrange for the Calloway family's car to be brought around, please?" "Of course, Your Grace." She turned back to the table one last time. "Dinner," she said, "is concluded." The Calloways departed the way people depart when dignity has become unaffordable. Loudly, with misdirected indignation, Margaret issuing several remarks to the air that no one acknowledged, Gerald moving with the stiff-shouldered posture of a man pretending the last hour had not happened. Vivienne left without looking at William. That, Alina thought, was its own kind of answer. The front doors closed. The manor settled into quiet. Mother and son stood alone in the dining room, the candles burning low between the abandoned glasses and the unfinished dessert plates. William exhaled slowly. He looked at the table, then at his hands, then finally at her. "You could have said something earlier," he said. "The first insult, the first you could have stopped it." "I could have," Alina agreed. She moved to stand beside him and placed her hand over his where it rested on the back of his chair. "But a single candle can only show you so much. I needed to see what they looked like in the dark." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded, the nod of a man who understood, even through his grief, that he had been protected rather than ambushed. He turned his hand over beneath hers and held it. They stood together in the old room, in the light of the burning down candles, in the particular silence of a house that has kept its integrity intact and knows it. 6 months later, Ashford Manor hosted a small dinner. No formal announcement. No occasion. Just William and a woman named Clara who had grown up 2 villages over and who worked, quietly and with great skill, as a restorative artist for the county museum. She had been introduced to William through a mutual friend who had mentioned, without particular emphasis, that she was kind. She arrived on time. She thanked Henderson by name when he took her coat, then asked, with genuine interest, how his wife's recovery was progressing. In the kitchen before dinner, she told the cook that whatever she was making smelled extraordinary and meant every word of it. At the table, she sat across from Alina. She did not perform. She did not manage. She simply spoke about her work, about a medieval altarpiece she had spent 4 months restoring, about the way you could sometimes see, beneath layers of damage and revision, the original intention of the artist, preserved perfectly, just waiting to be found again. Alina listened. She asked questions, real ones. At the end of the evening, when Clara excused herself to find her coat, William looked at his mother across the table. Alina was looking at the doorway through which Clara had just passed, her expression quiet and still. She reached for her wine glass. She lifted it slightly, not a toast, just a small, private acknowledgement, and smiled. She said nothing. She said everything.